I'm here to talk to you about breaking down your React app. And React is a fantastic technology I've been working with for 2.5 years now in production. And incidentally, 2.5 years is also the time that I haven't had a public talk yet. So a bit nervous here, but well, I hope it'll go okay. The last time I actually talked about Node.js, which is also a fascinating topic. And but React is a whole different thing. And how many of you are using React in your daily work? Quick show of hands. All right, okay. So before we start talking about React, I would like to tell you a little story. Who can tell me what this is here? Anyone? It's a green field. So a green field is what I think every developer dreams about, right? So you don't have any crap to deal with that your previous colleagues long gone built up there, and you can put everything up yourself. You have this nice green field, and you can put up your new product together with a great team of developers and product owners and working hard, choosing all the latest technologies, of course React and everything else, Node.js, whatever. And then, ta-da, here's your first release. Wonderful. It's a beautiful castle. It's just as the product owner envisioned. Well, it's a MVP, minimum viable product. But, well, it's got towers and trestles and flags. So everything is great. And, of course, the customer is really happy. So product owner says, OK, let's keep on working. Let's make the customer even more happy and build some more features for our product. And here we go. We put another tower on there. It looks great. Well, there's a few cracks starting to show, and one of the lights has gone out. But, well, we'll eventually get around to fixing that. But right now, we're working on this hot new feature that's coming out right up next. Well, yeah, another tower. And, well, it's OK. The old substance of the building is starting to kind of grow a bit on the bad side. But that's OK. We got a new tower, and everybody is really enthusiastic about it. And then, well, at some point, it all goes south, right? So I think we've all been there if we have been working professionally in software development for more than just a couple of months. As you work on a product, it grows old, and then something happens, something inevitable, that is called software entropy. So entropy is actually from physics, law of thermodynamics, means if people are working on a software together, then and modifications to the software are made, the software is going to grow more and more complex, and it's going to grow more and harder and harder to maintain, and you're accumulating technical debt. So you probably all heard the term technical debt. So how do you deal with this? Well, here's a nice chart that somebody incredibly smart, much smarter than me, Dr. Carola Lilienthal, came up with. And she proposes that a team, it's OK to have some measure of technical debt. That's the green lines here. We are working on a new feature, and your product is improving. That's fine, and you can let loose a bit for a time. But then you have to make sure that there's also phases of refactoring the product and making sure that you stay in that low technical debt zone where your product stays clean and maintainable. Because otherwise, if you cross that line and the legacy part of your software starts to grow, the part that doesn't have unit tests, for example, or that is way too complex and has too much code duplication and stuff like that, then at some point the technical debt is so high that it's very hard to actually put on new features with a reasonable amount of effort, and it gets very expensive to maintain the system. So what can you do? Well, oh crap, it's time for another rewrite, and we start the whole process over again. We have to throw everything away and start everything from scratch. Okay, so at eBay, we have one basic rule. It says that the time that the developers spend working should be divided into 2 portions. 70% of the time is making the customers happy, making the product owner happy. building new features, making the platform better. And the other 30% is tech time. Is actually that these green lines on the chart where you refactor the code base and make sure it stays clean. And it's very important. It's something that I'm really, really passionate about, because I've seen what happens if you don't really make an effort to actually take that time. You have to sometimes fight for it, because we all know, you probably all know, that the pressure is often high, and you need to, you're on a market that's competitive, and there are other people who are working on similar products, but there's no helping it. You have to spend some time actually getting the technical base, the platform right, and keeping it clean and maintainable. Okay, so a nice little story, but what does this actually have to do with React? So React comes with a promise. What got me so excited about React a couple of years ago when I started using it is the promise of having these components. It's all about components, right? So in React, you define your own little tags, and you can build your layout, not only your layout, also your whole application out of these wonderful React components. So the promise is that it will be able, with React, you will be able to make sure that your application is composed of various single parts, kind of like Lego bricks. So if I have a simple application, for example, I would have a footer and some posts, a search bar, a sidebar, a header. These are all the components that I'm building. These are React components that I'm building my page with. So I can just put them together, kind of like building Legos, right? I put my footer and my posts and my sidebar. I put my search on top and my header. So that's, voila, my nice little castle. And the good part about it is, other than it used to be, it's easy to replace these parts that I've composed my application of. So if somebody comes along and says, well, the header was nice, but we have an even nicer idea for a header, I can easily replace that by just swapping it out with a new, fancy new component. So here's my fancy new header React, and everything else in my application can just stay. And so the point is, there's really no helping that at some point parts of your software will fall prey to software entropy. But it's if you have well decoupled components and these parts start to rot, you can just replace them instead of having this whole giant ball of mud, as it's sometimes called, where everything is interconnected and it's not possible to throw away parts of it and remake parts of it without having to touch thousands of places in the code. And we probably all know the situation where we think we fixed a bug here and somewhere else something else is broken and nobody notices it. And so that's the promise of React to me, that it's actually now very easily possible to create a website that consists of all these nicely decoupled components. And to me, that's really the essence of working with React. And that's why I called my talk Break Down Your React App, because it's really important to embrace this, this principle, to create your application out of these independent building blocks and make sure it stays that way, because then you have the chance of getting a really well maintainable, good solid platform for building features and making the customer happy. So that being said, just because you're using React does not mean that it comes automatically, right? Because it's also very easy to just create a big ball of React mud or React component spaghetti. So when you if you just happily code away, you can create a mess just the same way that you could create a mess in the old jQuery days or the days before that. I don't even know what was before jQuery, plain vanilla JS, I guess. So there's some rules you should be aware of and some principles you should be aware of to actually make sure that what's valuable about React works for you, that you can embrace this concept and that you can really make React shine in your application and use its advantages. Otherwise, you'll just be left with a mess of code, tangled code that you have to throw away at some point because it's not maintainable anymore. So coming back to this feature time, tech time thing, the 30% tech time, to me, in the last years that I've been working with React, is actually about breaking it down. It's breakdown time. It's breaking down React time, the 30%. So as we were working on this application, which is, by the way, online community for motor enthusiasts, it's called Motor Talk, and the Motor Talk platform, it has to be said, was in a really sorry state 2 years ago. I guess it still is, but we are slowly working our way up on making Motor Talk technically stable and put it on a good new solid foundation. And we're doing that using React and Express Node server as the backend. And the rest of the talk, I would just like to share some insights that I've gained in the last 2 years. I've been working on this rewrite. It's a very small team. During these phases of breaking down, of refactoring, of making sure the code base stays maintainable. So here it is, breakdown number 1, separating logic and layout. So React is basically, the core of React is just a kind of glorified templating language, right? It's just the view layer. But React is also an ecosystem, and you can complement it with all kinds of additional libraries like React Router, Redux, and what have you, everything. So you have to make sure that you adhere to this principle of separating the logic and the layout to make it easy to understand the logic that's behind your user interface. Let's start with a simple code example. This is just a very basic box that fetches some hacker news. And as you can see here, this is kind of a naive approach of React. It's just the basics. We have a component. It has a constructor, and it initializes its state. That's the top stories. It's an array of stories. Each item in the array has a title and a URL. And then I have this load method to my story, and that just fetches the top stories from a service component, from a service module, and then it sets the state of the component, right? So we probably, if you've been working with React, you've probably done something similar to this. And here we have the render method of the component. The top stories are in the state, or they are after the top stories have been loaded asynchronously. Of course, we know when the application is starting, the top stories are not there yet. So what do? We display a spinner for the time that the top stories have not been loaded yet. And when the state has been updated, here, fetch top stories is done. We're using async await here, similar to promises. We set the state, then we have some data, and then we just iterate through our top stories and display them in the page, right? And then we have a little button just to demonstrate. You can click the update, and then it does the same as it does when the component is initially mounted to the DOM. It loads the data. So what's wrong with this? What's not like? Looks good, right? Well, one of the problems is that the layout code, the HTML code, is intermingled with the logic, right? So we have some logic that decides, do we have top stories or not? Should we show a spinner or not? And we have some logic that handles loading the stories, and that's all tangled up with the actual layout, the logic that displays the data. For such a simple use case, that's okay. But imagine having a large page where tons of stuff is going on. It's not just one component that fetches data. Data is fetched for a lot of components. They're all entangled and intertwined with each other, and you're starting to have side effects. One thing is loaded, the other is not. What can you do then and stuff? And then you get to the point where you say, okay, we have to adjust the layout, we have to move this bit from there, but where to start? Where can we, how do we move this when it's already in an if statement that decides should it be displayed or not? So it gets messy really quick if you work with React this way. Okay, so how can we improve this? There's this concept of presentational and container components. So the top mind of React, Dan Abramov, did a nice blog article a couple of years back where he explained the concept that you should differentiate between presentational and container components. The presentational components are also called dumb components. They shouldn't have any logic in them. They should just have the job of displaying the data that is passed to them as props. Everything else should be handled by container components or smart components. And the smart component would tell the container component basically what to do. And if you separate these two, you have the advantage that you can write unit tests separately for them. For example, you can test if the logic that creates the data works properly, and on the other hand, you can see if it's displayed properly. So revisiting that Hacker News example, slightly less crappy this time. We have, I made myself some nice dumb components. We have a box, a button, a footer, a header, and these are just, you know, layout, just HTML code, loading some CSS. I won't go into CSS a lot here, but it's just each component has its own style sheet. And the main component imports these layout components. Okay, I think the mic just went away, but it's back again. Great. So it imports these layout components and creates the page from that. So, as I said, slightly less crappy. It's at least we have some layout logic lifted, but still, it's still kind of intertwined. So we haven't gotten very far yet. So I was when I started using React, very quickly, very dissatisfied with this situation, because I thought it would be ideal to have the separation of containers and layout components, presentational components, in a very clear and better way. Actually, the container components perhaps shouldn't be real React components at all. They should just be kind of programs that pass the data to the presentational components. That would be nice. So I was actually in Paris 2 years ago at the React Conf, and there was one talk that's mentioned here by Andrew Clark, and he set up a library called Recompose. I don't know if you've heard about it. It's really nice. It's they describe it as a Lodash for React. I don't really know if that fits really well, but it's all about higher order components. Who of you has heard of higher order components? So higher order components are basically just components that get a component as input, functions that get a component as import, do something and create another component as output with some props prepared for them. So we can lift the state from the presentational component that we had before into a container component. And Recompose offers us all kinds of tools to do this in a really concise and really clear way. And I was really excited when I started using it. So here's an example how my refactored container would look like. So it doesn't even import React anymore. It doesn't have to, because it's basically just a composition of different functions, right? So I have one function with state that creates a top story state. One function as a second parameter, I create a setter for the state, and then I can define handlers that fetch the data and then put it using the setter in the state. Then I have this lifecycle thing to make sure that the data loading is happening when the component is mounted to the DOM. And this is just, I call this in the composition of all these higher order components is called enhance. And then I can just call this enhance function with my Hacker News component. So if you've worked with Redux, you're probably familiar with it. It's pretty much the same that React Redux does with this function where you connect the Redux state to your component. It's the same thing, right? It's just composition of higher order functions to create a higher order component. And now my presentational components looks a lot cleaner now. All I have, because everything is not passed as a state, but it's rather passed in as props. So it's much easier to test. I can just test, okay, if I pass in an empty array as top stories, then just render the spinner. And if there are top stories, just render the box. And when I click on the button, I get this load function passed in also as a prop to reload the news. Okay. And I have to be perfectly honest with you. I did a eBay Tech Talk 3 years ago, I think it was, about functional programming. And back in the day, I was really excited about the concept, but it can be a bit of a brain teaser. So at first, it takes some getting used to getting the mental model of a function, creating a function that executes a function. But once you crawl down that rabbit hole, and if you really understand what it works, you see that's a really powerful concept, because you can just compose your components of these individual parts, which you could also easily put into separate modules and also write separate unit tests for. So that's what I did with this. Okay, next example, I just put the spinner also in there, right? So I can have a higher order component that checks is the top story is null, and if so, then render the spinner, and otherwise just render the presentational component. Here's my presentation component now, so it doesn't even have the spinner in it anymore. It just has some top stories and a load function. That's it, blammo. So no logic in here anymore, just pure layout, and everything is lifted to the container. And then I can actually refactor this into something like this, which makes for, I think, very good to read code. It just says, okay, I'm creating a container here that has some top stories, and it loads on mount, and it has a spinner, and I'm going to use this container to enhance my Hacker News presentational component. And everything is nicely encapsulated away into these enhancer functions. I have to put on the mic so I can. Here we go. So here's one of these enhancers. As you can see, you can compose these enhancer functions with each others, and they all use this recompose library for putting it all together. So once we had spent our 30% tech time to refactor our code base to use these tools and refactor the container components into these functional components, it was much easier to write tests for the software. It was much easier to understand what's actually going on in the software, because I really like it if you have really, really small code modules. If I open up a JavaScript file that has more than 20 or 30 lines, already my head starts to hurt. And I think, well, couldn't we make this somehow smaller? Because I like really small files that you can easily see what's going on, and that you can easily write tests for. So that was that. So we built some more features, made the customer a bit more happy, if that's even possible, because our customers are, of course, very, very happy. And then was refactoring time again. And the next thing we tackled was separating the layout components into a style guide. Because now that I have properly separated my dump presentational component and my smart container component, there's nothing keeping me from just putting these all together in a different GitHub repository and just deliver them through our internal NPM registry as single components. And that's exactly what we did. So right now, we have this demo UI NPM package that provides all these header, footer, button, list item, box, and they are all completely separated, versionized, so I can have semantic versioning. I do pull requests. I can release beta versions. If I create a new version of the box, then I can test it first and I can introduce it gradually. I don't have to make breaking changes to my entire code base all at once because everything is nicely separated. And that's what I really like about open source, actually, because I think we have a lot to learn from the way, even if we're not actually actively contributing to open source, we can learn a lot from it by using the same mechanisms and tools. For example, the npm registry or pull requests on GitHub. And at eBay, we are lucky enough to have our own internal GitHub. It's kind of an enterprise GitHub that works just the same as the public GitHub. And we actually do this. We set up a lot of repositories that are independent from each other and create pull requests for that and write tickets for them to keep track of how the software is changing. It's a great way to work. And once I have my layout components in a separate repository, I can create a living style guide using Storybook, for example. It's very easy. I can write these kind of stories that describe the way that my layout components work, and it's totally independent from my mothership app, right? So it's just a totally separate separate project where I have the bare layout. So and we have actually our designer who started getting interested in React and CSS. And when he takes a look at our main code base, it's a bit too much cognitive load for him. But he said, oh, that's interesting. I can see there's just CSS files and basically HTML in those presentational components. We keep all the functional programming stuff away from him to not confuse him too much. And so he's actually happy with creating his own pull requests if he wants to change, for example, the spacing or the color or something, and then he can release new versions of the presentational components, all without really bothering us, because he's working on a totally different projects, and when his work is done, we can just step up our dependency numbers in our package JSON, and then we have the new version that he created for us. And also nice about Storybook is that you can actually include the README MD files right there, and we take extra great care to document what our software does. Through these READMEs, we find that creating documentation that's too far away from the code, for example, in Wiki is outdated the day you write it, so it doesn't make much sense. But more so, it makes much more sense to have this close to the code, and README file is right there in the GitHub repository, and the Storybook can display this. So each of these components would show how you do, how you install it for your project, how you import it, what it does, and what props you have that you can use to use the component. So that was breakdown number 2. Now we're building a couple more features, make the customer happy, yada yada, and then it's time to do interesting stuff again. Breakdown number 3, organizing our modules. Actually, I thought a bit about if I should actually include this, because it doesn't come with fancy code examples and stuff like that. It's more about, the idea is more about how you actually organize all those JavaScript files you have there. It sounds a bit boring at first, but it makes good sense, so please bear with me. I came across this slide by Cristano Rastelli a couple of years ago. Some of you may have seen a variant of this on Twitter in some form or the other. So back in the 20th century, ye olden days, we had separation of concerns. And separation of concerns for us web developers meant we have the concern of JavaScript, we have the concern of CSS, and we have the concern of HTML. And we have to keep those nice and separate because they're totally different worlds, right? So this idea has kind of been invalidated because it's more about the features that should be separated and not the technology. So it doesn't make sense to put your JavaScript in one tidy little bin and the CSS in another tidy little bin and the HTML in another. They work together to create parts of your application, components. So that's why some people say that the current age that we're living in now is the component age. components are not only the basic principle of React, it's also the basic principles of Vue.js or of Angular or Polymer, web components, obviously. So this is the bright new future, right? So you shouldn't, you should make sure that your concerns are separated by the actual business function that they have, the actual feature, the actual reason why they are there, not what the kind of language they use. So I have to admit there that in the beginning I kind of stepped in the trap. I was still a 20th century guy, if you will, because when I was building my application, and we are using Redux, I have to confess at this point, I kind of organized my code at first the same way that I used to in the 20th century. I had this nice component folder with all my presentational components in it. I had this container directory with all my smart container components. I had enhancers, I had actions, reducers, and sagas for asynchronous data loading, selectors, I'll get into that later. And then also totally separate, I had a directory with tests. So this looks nice and tidy, but if your application starts becoming more complex and you don't only have a board list and a thread list, these are actually, this is actually a screenshot from our codebase now, not Hacker News demo. And but you have, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 different containers, then the list gets really long and starts getting really unwieldy. And at some point I realized I'm just basically doing the exact same thing that was done here, right? I put my my components in one directory, my containers in another, my actions in another. But does it really make sense? No. I have to organize my code differently by the use case that I have. So that's how we set up our code base now. We actually separated our code base by use case. So we have this board list, and each and that has its own actions, its own components. It has its and we decided to actually put the containers in there too, because the container is basically just enhancing the component, but it's all about the board list, right? So each of these directories should have precisely one main component that should be exposed, and everything else is just kind of internal workings. And then we have another module called the thread list, and well, you could have more and more and more and more. And then you can, it's much easier to navigate through the code and to understand what's going on, and you can also see at one glance at the directory tree what the app is actually composed of, or the various components and modules it's composed of. So much nicer. And then we got together and discussed how should we actually organize the JavaScript modules within these directories, within these components. Or we thought, what is this board list? Is it a module? No, a module is a single JavaScript file. So what should we call it? Should we call it component module or what? So we just made up our own new word, and because this is kind of a Lego presentation, we just decided to call them bricks. What the hell? So we said, okay, we have a board list brick, we have a thread list brick, we have a footer brick, a header brick, a sidebar brick, whatever brick. Everything is a brick, and each brick should adhere to some rules. So each brick should just have one main component. It's very important, so you can see that there's one React component at the heart of the thing. That's, if you recall the slide that I had with these Lego bricks with the footer and the sidebar, that would be the root that displays the thing. That's the only thing that you have to put in your page layout to actually get the component to be shown on your page. There should be only one of them. And each brick should have one root file that exposes everything that's interesting for outside the brick. So I don't have to look in the directories where I have to import stuff. I can just import the single index.js file from the base module, so I can just import something from board list, import something from thread list. That makes it easier to understand what's going on. So this was our important step on our way to separating our application into these independent modules by starting to think about these decoupled bricks, as we call them, in a whole new way, because it kind of changed the way we work, because we started thinking about, okay, I have this stupid rule that doesn't allow me from within the brick, I should not import modules from outside. How can I do this? So I'm kind of forced to think about abstraction and using utility methods, putting them perhaps in separate repositories, exposing them as imports to make it easier to keep the bricks separated. And all this would not have been possible if we hadn't talked to each other a lot. And at this point, I'm going to take a short break from the techno talk and talk about something that's really important to me personally. I have the great pleasure of working in a very, very great team. And we communicate a lot. We sit together a lot. We discuss at our at the whiteboard and put little sticky notes and talk to each other how we should organize our code and make up these rules, contribution rules. So this is really important to me to say it out loud. Maintaining a healthy code base is actually not really a technical task, it's a process task. It's a process of people deciding together how they should organize their work. So get out that chair and take off those headphones. There, I said it. It's kind of cheesy, but I had to say it because it's really important to me. Okay, so we're back in the 70% phase. Building some more features, making the customers happy, having fun. And then it gets interesting again. We're breaking down Redux. Okay, so who of you is using Redux actually? Oh, yeah. And MobX? Somebody else? Or just plain React state? Okay, interesting. So, Redux. Lately, there's been a lot of talk about Redux, and people are starting to blame Redux for a lot of things and say, oh, it's so much boilerplate, it's so complicated, it's such high cognitive load. But I actually like Redux because, well, it's not the right tool for all jobs. If I have this Hacker News box that I showed you earlier, it's basically okay just to have an internal state for this one module, component, brick, whatever you call it. But sometimes that doesn't suffice because you want the bricks to actually talk to each other, to have interaction, and then it starts getting complicated if you're just passing down state via props and stuff. So Redux comes in handy at this point. I've created another version of my demo that actually uses Redux. So now I have, I can use, put this away, oops. It does that sometimes. So now I wrap this provider around my my application. I have my Hacker News box, and just to show off what Redux does, I also put in a page header here. Right now the page header doesn't do much, it just displays the title. And how does it get the title? It connects. It's similar to what I showed you earlier with recompose. It's a higher order function that just fetches the data from the Redux state and then passes it to the presentational component that shows the title. And my Hacker News works pretty much the same way. It also has this reducer. I won't get too much into how Redux works and what it does. I have a nice movie coming up where I'll show you what this actually, how this is working. Just so to quickly go through this, it's all about having one global state that is shared by all the components, and all the data that's happening in the application is in this one nested structure, and that's the single source of truth for my application. That's what's really nice about Redux. So in my state here, I would have the title that I need for the header, and I would have the data that's displayed in the Hacker News box, and that's stored in the Redux state, which is then used to display it. Okay, so I promised a movie, and I'm really proud of this. First time I made a movie. So I'm going to show you how this Redux works actually. So at first we have the Hacker News container component, and it looks at the state and says, hey, do we have any top stories? No, we don't have any top stories. Oh my God. Okay, so I'm going to display a spinner component because there's nothing to display yet. Then I'm going to dispatch a Redux action. It's called load top story start. Now I have a saga that actually does the asynchronous data fetching from Hacker News, gets nice JSON set of JSON data, dispatches another Redux action that's called load top story success that has the JSON data as a payload. The reducer notices this and modifies the state, the single source of truth. This container sees, new data, then it removes the spinner and displays the Hacker News data in the box. So that's basically in a nutshell how Redux works. So why all the complexity? Why do I have to dispatch these action things? And what is the saga supposed to be? Why all that boilerplate code? I have to set up so much stuff to do one simple thing. Wasn't it much easier? Before, the code example that I showed you before, it was just one fetch data function. Great, got the code, and now I have to set up an action, I have to set up a saga, I have to set up a reducer, I have to set up another action and all that. Why, for the love of God, would you do that? Well, for most cases, I think it's pretty much okay to just have a state. And that's also what the inventor of Redux, whom I've mentioned earlier, Dan Abramov, says. Redux is not for everybody. You probably don't need Redux even. You can do simple use cases without Redux. But sometimes, at some point, you start to wonder, so what if I had a title and I want to update the news that's displayed in this box from a button in the title? I can't really do that because if I don't use Redux, because this is all encapsulated nicely in my separated module, my separated brick, whatever you call it. So I can hit an update button that's in there to update the internal state, but I can't really tell the component from outside to update its state. Well, I could, but it would make things really complicated. And with Redux, I can just dispatch this action that triggers the loading of the data from anywhere in my application. So from a totally different component, I can just say update the news, and here we go, and the component picks up that because it's the sharing the state with the whole application. The state is not only inside this box, but the state is everywhere, and I can make the bricks, the components, talk to each other. And also, if you if I reload the page here, if it works, you can see that I don't have a loading spinner at the beginning. The Hacker News is there instantly. How does that work? Because the Redux state is hydrated when the application is initialized. I'm simulating rendering on the server here. So that's really important for us because of SEO, search engine optimization, to have HTML rendered in the back end. It might not be important for you, but for us it's a big deal. So we actually have our HTML, our React components rendered in the backend. We also have our data fetched in the backend, and we just put it in the DOM as JSON. That's then parsed when the app is started, and this is basically the Redux state right there in the HTML code. And that way, I can have the Hacker News box filled instantly when it starts up, and it doesn't start loading the data when it is rendered first. So it's also really important for us, and that's also very easy to do with Redux, and very, very hard to do if you don't use Redux or some other similar technology like MobX, for example. Okay. So if we come back to our concept of a brick, it gets a bit more complex. The version of the brick that we have before would just have to expose the basic container component to display this box with news. Now we have I have different studs. I learned these things are called. I looked it up. And so to connect my brick to the application, I have the component. They have the actions because I want to perhaps be able to dispatch actions to my brick component. I have a reducer that takes care of modifying the global state that the whole application is using. I have these sagas. I won't get into the how these work. It's just for asynchronous operations. But these also have to be initialized when I want to use the brick. And I can also use an initial state. That's not really that important. In some cases it is, but I won't go into it that much. So here's the index.js file I talked about earlier. So this is what it would look like. I expose all the different stats of my little Lego bricks as exports, so I can just import Hacker News from Hacker News. I can import the Hacker News actions. I can import the root reducer, the root saga, and the initial state. So there's still one thing missing here. So what's actually wrong with this? It works, it's fine, but there's one thing that still bothered me. That's you have to know where actually the data for the Hacker News is located in the global state. This part of the drawing represents the global Redux state that stores everything that the app has to know, all the app's data. And I have to find some way to tell my Hacker News brick that, okay, you're going to find the part of the global state that's interesting to you under modules Hacker News. Please be aware of that. Okay, thanks, bye. So you would have to kind of make up a contract with your colleagues to say, okay, let's always put that stuff under modules, and then we'll kind of get it to work that way, because we can assume that. But it's kind of lame, because I want to decouple my brick component 100%. I just want to put it in a separate GitHub repository and be able to npm install it into just about any application. I don't care. And I don't want to write in the README, okay, you're going to have to set up your Redux state in such and such way so for this thing to work. That would kind of suck. So the last thing I'm going to share with you today. Colleague of mine, Daniel Schäfer, really smart guy. It was not my idea, it was his. I'm just presenting it and getting all the laurels for it. He came up with this idea of using selectors. Selectors is not a concept that he or we invented, but the way we use selectors is, I think, new and interesting. So basically a selector is just an indirect way of taking data from the state. It's just a function that gets a state, the global state, as an input, and makes sure that there is a state and there are top stories. Then it will return the state, the top stories from the state. Otherwise, it will return null. Okay, so you've noticed it doesn't say state.modules.topstories. It just says state.topstories. That's because this selector is globalized, rebased, as it were. It's inside the Hacker News brick, inside the module. But it doesn't know anything about the global state. And this state is sort of prepared in a special way to know the global state with this simple function called register selectors. So we've created a library that where you can use this register selectors for use with global state. Sounds kind of like a name that a Java developer would come up with, actually, now that I look at it. And you can use that to define a path. So this, the selectors for this component is under modules.hackernews, and then it imports, if you recall, from the index file, imports the selectors, and then those selectors are readily prepared, and then they can just happily use the state the way they seem fit. So that was the missing part of the puzzle. The 6 Lego brick stat would be the selectors that I'm importing. And I think this is a really nice thing. If you work with Redux, you might have come to this point where you thought it's not satisfactory that on the one hand you have the global state, on the other hand you want to make sure that your components that consume this global state are decoupled. So here it is, with this library you will be able to decouple them. And yeah, since we also want to give back to the community, we've created an open source component that you can use in your own project by importing it via npm. It's called Modular Toolkit. So, and use I can just put my Hacker News brick into a different module. This is all in the modular toolkit GitHub repository. You find all these code examples, and I'm importing my demo module into this code sandbox now. So everything has been moved. I only have the page header here, and everything else lives in GitHub. I have an UI components style guide that shows how the layout components are set together, and that's also in a separate repository, also in modular toolkit. If you're interested, you can look at it. And my main application's job is really just putting all those bricks together. It's just gluing them up, wiring them up with very minimal code. So that would be, for me, the perfect place to develop in, having your application broken into these single pieces that you can just, by some well-defined rules, you can put them together and build your applications out of them. And it would be very easy if I wanted to. So I have a Hacker News box on one page in one application, and then I have another application that would you think, oh, it would be nice to also have some Hacker News there, when you can just wire it up, put it in there, and it doesn't matter. You can do it. So this is actually a little schema that shows how our application is working. So we have two different classes of servers. There's actually multiple servers because we have a lot of traffic, but for simplicity, I'll just put in two. One is responsible for rendering the app, the HTML code, and the other is for providing the API that fetches the data. The app gets the JSON data from the API server. We are currently, in our next 30% tech time, we are going to start integrating GraphQL to do this. Right now it's just regular classic data fetching. And rendering the HTML code on the server, delivering it into mobile phones. Right now the application we're working on is solely for mobile phones, but we will expand our platform to also serve desktop browsers. Currently the legacy platform is still responsible for desktop browsers. And the app just uses different NPM modules. Our project is called Poly. For reasons I won't get into, you gotta have a name for something. And we have a separate repository that actually contains the bricks that the application is built out of. And both these use another module, MTUI, that just contains the presentational components. And we have a living style guide that uses the presentational components to allow you to see how the application is styled and how the layout is put together. So there it is, our beautiful castle that we're working on. And hopefully this talk has been interesting for you, and perhaps you will also build some beautiful castle in the future, if you are not already building a beautiful castle. I have built a lot of beautiful castles. So thank you very much for listening, and I would like to thank my team. Have I mentioned already that they're awesome? They are awesome. And yeah, you can view this presentation online under this URL. I'll also tweet it out, so you can follow me on Twitter if you like. It's vkatz, because my last name is Hund. Get it? Hund vkatz. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. And if you have questions, just hit me up later. I'll stick around for some time. And yeah, of course, also as Nina mentioned, we are also still looking for one developer who has some experience with React to work on a hot new project that we're developing right now. So if you're interested in that, also just tap me on the shoulder and ask me. Thank you very much.